In this section, I want to be specific in our definition of who a refugee is, who an internally displaced person is, and why that difference is quite dramatic in the effects and the services supplied to the person who is moving from one place and trying to seek to move a safer or better environment someplace else. So the legal definition of who a refugee is dates back to the 1951 United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees, which defines a refugee as a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, and is outside their country of his or her nationality. And within that is an important, several important concepts that we need to really disentangle. That is, you have to have a well-founded fear of being persecuted. So there's you have to have some evidence for a fear of being persecuted either by your government or some other group within your state for a particular reason of race, religion, nationality, or member of a particular social group or political opinion, and to be outside the country of their nationality. And that last bit, I think, is the main differentiator between refugees and internally displaced people, that there is an international convention categorizing who's a refugee and what resources they have by sheer fact of being outside their country, and internally displaced person, which we're going to get to in a second. When you have refugees moving to another country, there are basically three main ways that you can deal with them. You can, if you are a destination state, or if you as a refugee yourself, you can choose to voluntarily go back, voluntary repatriation. You see a lot of that in the aftermath of the Taliban's fall in 2001. You had a lot of Afghans repatriating from neighboring countries like Pakistan, as well as farther afield like the United States, because they saw the political situation change in their home country. The chance of being persecuted was systematically different. Of course, now in 2022, after the Taliban has retaken control of Afghanistan, there have been a huge swath of those people seeking to move abroad again, successfully or tragically unsuccessfully in certain cases. Local integration is the second way you can have a durable solution. If you're a refugee, you can integrate with a local society in your destination state, as a number of successful cases in my own life and in my experience in the U.S. You see, it is a country that prides itself, like Australia, as being a country of immigrants, and seeing the what makes the state is more desire for political liberty and freedom rather than being from any particular background. Of course, the history is more problematic than that. There were systematic restrictions about who is able to migrate to the U.S., similar to policies in Australia, of course. And so you have the ideals and then the reality, though you do see people still voting with their feet and seeking to integrate in the destination state. And third country resettlement, you have people who try to go from country A to country B. Country B might not want to accept them. They process them as refugees and then send them to some other country C. You can see an example of that even during the pandemic in Australia, in which you had refugees flown from Australia and the PNG to the U.S., even despite the travel bans, due to an agreement struck between Australia and the United States. And so even the pandemic didn't prevent some of these flights and settlement in a third country occur. And I think when you talk about voluntary repatriation, the first element that I mentioned there out of the durable solutions for refugees, voluntary repatriation, the key is it has to be voluntary. There's a legal term, for those of you who are law scholars, you're probably more familiar with this than me, the idea of non-refoulement, that refugees should not be forced to return to their home country if they had a realistic fear of persecution, because they are more likely to pay the cost with their lives if they are repatriated. And unfortunately, coming from the U.S. and the number of people who went across the border in recent years, and the political pressures on the American government, both from the right and the left, in order to try to deal with these flows. A lot of people were repatriated to Central American countries, and there's a lot of examples of people being killed on, if not right after arriving, but shortly after arriving. And so that's why the idea of non-refoulement is crucial in the durable solution of refugees. Is the decision has to be voluntary to return to their home country. If there is that fear of prosecution, you don't want to send people back to their deaths. The difficulty, of course, now is with the sheer size and scale of the people that are forcibly displaced, over 82 million as of last count. There is limited desire and ability to absorb those numbers in those top 10 countries that I mentioned earlier. And so you see a lot of people being settled or having to stay in countries neighboring their conflicted state, often developing countries, and not heading to countries like, or able to head to countries like the United States or Australia. I know the definition and the stringency with which the U.S. follows procedures to try to make sure that the people who do settle in the U.S. that meet the definition of a refugee are not security risks, and that can take multiple years and hard to get some of the documentation in order to prove a well-founded fear of prosecution. But the takeaway from this graph here is you can see in the last decade a dramatic increase in the amount of people that were forcefully displaced. Over 20 million would fall under the definition of refugees under the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner of Refugees mandate. Palestinian refugees have their own specific mandate due to the long-standing challenge of the growth in Palestinian society, both within Palestine as well as without, going back 6 decades now, which we talked about with the Gaza Strip example a couple of weeks ago. And then you see the number of internally displaced people dramatically exceed the number of refugees. And then you see Venezuelans down at the bottom, that you have the Venezuelan case, which we touched on a couple of weeks ago, one that has fallen out of news, kind of like with Syria, but in one in which you have millions of people in neighboring states, as well as trapped within the country, trying to seek a better life, either for economic reasons or well-founded fears of political prosecution. Okay, so where did all these people go? Mostly to fellow developing countries. Least developing countries as of 2015 had a quarter of refugees, and the number of refugees hosted are highest in Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, and Germany. Only Germany, I think, there would be defined as a most developed country. Most of them are hosting refugees from neighboring countries. Turkey, mostly from Syria. Colombia, refugees from Venezuela. Pakistan, refugees from Afghanistan. Uganda, refugees from South Sudan, mostly in recent years, but also from DRC to a more limited extent. And then Germany had a quite open policy back in 2015 for trying to resettle refugees. Over 2/3 of refugees in 2020 came from just 5 countries, which shows the connections between all the different strands of this class, environmental and economic hardships, conflict and population pressures. Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar, all refugees coming from areas with civil conflict. Venezuela hasn't reached the stage of full-blown civil conflict, more political prosecution and economic hardship. So you see how conflict can have an effect on migration, and then migration in turn, as we're going to see in a later segment today, can affect conflict as well. refugees as a share of world population. However, you might see that the numbers have spiked in recent years now, still not as high as a percentage of the world's population as it was at the end of the Cold War, which I hope helps provide a bit of context that these numbers now are unprecedented, 82 million people around the world, although the population has also increased quite dramatically. And so in this class, we've talked about the importance of level and change. And so the change might be increased, but the level as a percentage of the population is not quite as high as it has been in previous time periods. And I plotted the difference between refugees and asylum seekers here using data from the UNHCR a couple of years ago now. But I think this graph really displays the difference between people who have refugee status and those that are looking for it. People who haven't been determined as legitimate refugees are considered asylum seekers once they do cross an international border, and that procedure before you're defined as a refugee, which gives you rights and additional protections, can take quite a long period of time. And so you see asylum seekers are becoming more common, including in Australia, though not as dramatically nearly as other countries. This graph I also downloaded from UNHCR statistics a couple of years ago shows how the Australian government's willingness to accept refugees have changed quite dramatically over time. In the aftermath of World War II was quite high. Then in the 70s and the 80s, after the Vietnam War, the wars in Southeast Asia, and then declining pretty dramatically after the end of the Cold War, and then after 2005. This graph is one that I just wanted to show how connected to the case study we're going to look at the end of today with the Syrian conflict, how Turkey as a destination for refugees and Syria as a source changed quite dramatically in the course of a couple of years. And I think, unfortunately, with the current war in Ukraine is also going to enter in this graph in a couple of years. And so you see the spike coming from South Sudan is matched by the spike coming to Turkey and other neighboring countries. Ooh. And a lot of those migrants try to make their way to Europe as a region in which the people might have networked connections, history, or family, or friends, as well as economic opportunity. You see the different routes from conflicted areas, Turkey going through Eastern Europe into Northern Europe, and from Morocco and Libya to Italy and the rest of Europe. And there's been a lot. I mentioned in one of the earlier slides the number of people who have died in trying to make these crossings across the Mediterranean. You see that spike quite dramatically in early 2015 and then early 2016. You have had other spikes. One boat could cost a couple of hundred lives, but that they have pretty much stabilized since the government's cracked down and made agreements. Turkey made agreements with European states to try to limit the amount of refugees coming across borders, and that's seen as pretty much being effective. You can just see that visually here in this graph, that you had that huge swell in numbers in 2015, 2016. Governments changed their policies, made economic agreements with Turkey to try to get them to settle closer to their conflicted state, made an argument that people are going to want to go back home eventually, and the closer they are, the easier it'll be to do that. Of course, the harder it would be in their quality of life until they're able to do that. And the people who seek asylum before they become refugees, different where you end up could have a dramatic effect as to how likely you are to be considered a refugee. This graph from 2018, I think, makes this quite clear, that the number of people who are rejected, their asylum applications are rejected and they're not considered refugees, which mean they can be deported. Ireland was quite unlikely to reject asylum seekers. Less than 15% of people were rejected, compared to the Czech Republic, in which 90% of people were rejected. And you see variations across the different countries. Switzerland was also quite likely to accept people, but it really does show the importance of the political decisions in the destination state to decide whether to let people in. And that can change, right? The Germany's initial openness faced some backlash and policy changes and agreements made with Turkey. Other countries could just make it physically harder for people to cross their borders. Everyone talks about the wall that the U.S. tried to build with Mexico, which has also fallen off the headlines with the end of the Trump administration. Bulgaria in 2014, as those migrant flows were starting to swell, built a 30-kilometer border fence along its border with Greece and Turkey, which you can see here is more feasible than it might be for other countries with longer borders like the US and Mexico. That's thousands of kilometers. And so you see the practical, political, and economic difficulties in trying to deal with people that are trying to flee conflict or persecution. And these are, by and large, the lucky ones, the ones that got outside the country. Internally displaced people, this definition is basically those who stay within their country. Stay within the country and remain under the protection, nominal protection of its government, even if that government is the reason for their displacement. They often move to areas where it's difficult for the UNHCR to deliver humanitarian assistance, and as a result, these people are amongst the most vulnerable people in the world. So these people who are fleeing conflict or persecution, often the repression of their own state, but aren't able to cross the border, don't have even the chance to apply for asylum and for refugee status. And so you see in the end of 2020, some 48 million people were internally displaced due to armed conflict, generalized violence, or human rights violations. And so you see almost half, you saw in the earlier graph how much larger the number of IDPs were compared to refugees. This is a heartbreaking photo of an IDP in Ukraine. You've seen a huge growth in IDPs and international refugees, often women and children from Ukraine. This is a map showing the number of people who have were IDPs due to conflict or natural disaster around the world. And the takeaway is that there's less IDPs due to economic reasons, right, the ones in green, but more likely due to conflict and natural disaster. And you're more likely to see those conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia, some in Central America, but you see disasters are much more widespread, which is going to connect in our discussion in subsequent weeks. You can see, right, where the number of IDPs are. There's a lot of overlap with refugees, people who moved across borders. Syria, DRC, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, El Salvador, Yemen, South Sudan. A lot of these larger countries like the DRC or South Sudan makes it more difficult to actually cross international borders, which might explain why some of those numbers are larger for larger states. Nigeria would be another one as well. Disaster-related events, you see a more wider swath of different states, and you can see the different hazards. Storms and floods, of course, are the most common reasons for people being displaced, as you can see as I record this video, in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland here in Australia. Whew. So taking a step back, I know this is tough stuff, and it can be hard to really wrap your head around what it takes for people to make these decisions to go abroad, as well as the difficult decisions that political leaders have to make when trying to deal with these persistent but difficult challenges of people trying to seek safety and security and economic opportunity in other states. So this is just the background and defining refugees and IDPs and showing the size and scale of those refugee flows and how they can ebb and flow over time with peaks like with Syria in 2015 and 2016. Now I want to move on from those relatively clear-cut, and we could teach an entire class. I know Kim Hyun does it in my department on refugees. It is a fascinating topic, and there's a whole literature on connections between refugees and conflict, which I'm going to kind of wave my hand at later. You teach an entire class on IDPs and human security or development. But now I want to spend a bit of time talking about environmental refugees, because I think this connects to a lot of students' interests in my class, as well as with a lot of themes of climate change and scarcity that we've talked about already. So let's go ahead and turn to that now.